In the shadow of a world alight with the fires of war, Josef, a young immigrant with dreams as vast as the American plains, finds himself caught in the maelstrom of history's greatest conflict. His journey from the cobbled streets of a distant homeland to the blood-soaked trenches of the battlefield is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As the world around him changes irreversibly, Josef must navigate the chaos of war and the turmoil within himself, all while holding on to the faint glimmer of hope that one day he might find his way back to the peace he once knew. This is the story of courage and survival, of loss and triumph, of a man who realized how vast America was, only when he saw the enormity of the war that engulfed it. In the early hours of a chilly morning in 1941, Josef gazed upon the towering Statue of Liberty as the ship slowly made its way into New York Harbor. He was just one of the many tired faces among the crowd of immigrants, each carrying a mix of hope and worry in their eyes. America, the land of opportunity, seemed like a giant full of mystery and promise, but also uncertainty, especially now with the war rumbling in the distance. As Josef stepped off the ship, the sounds of the bustling city hit him like a wave. The towering buildings, the endless flow of people, the cars honking loudly, it was all so overwhelming yet thrilling. America was vast in every sense, and he felt both lost and found in its enormity. Settling into a small, cramped apartment in a crowded neighborhood, Josef began to take in his new surroundings. The streets were alive with different languages and smells, people from all corners of the world trying to make this new place their home, just like him. But beneath the excitement, there was tension in the air. News of the war overseas was always in the background, in hushed conversations at the market or blaring from radio headlines. As days turned into weeks, Josef found work at a factory. It was hard and tiring, but it was honest work, and he was proud to contribute to his new home. But the war was never far from anyone's mind. Posters lined the streets, urging men to join the fight for freedom, and talks of drafting soldiers became more frequent. Then, one ordinary day, as Josef returned from a long shift, he found a draft notice waiting for him. The war had seemed like a distant thunder until now, but it had come to his doorstep. He was being called to serve for the country he had barely begun to call home. That night, Josef sat at the small wooden table in his apartment, the draft notice in hand. He thought about his family far away, the life he had left behind, and the new one he was still building. He realized that this vast new world had its own trials and tribulations, and now he was to become a part of its defining struggle. As he looked out of the window at the sprawling cityscape, the reality set in. He was no longer just an observer. He was now a participant in the unfolding history of this great land. With a mixture of fear and resolve, Josef knew that his journey had taken a new turn. The war was no longer just a story from the headlines. It was his story now. He didn't know what the future held, but as he gazed out into the night, the vastness of America seemed to echo his own thoughts and feelings. There was fear, yes, but also a sense of belonging to something much larger than himself. He was part of the American story now, and whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the courage and hope that had brought him to these shores. And with that, Josef tucked the draft notice into his coat pocket, stepped out into the cool night air, and walked the streets of his new neighborhood, lost in thought about the vast journey ahead. The morning sun barely lit the small room where Josef slept. The draft notice from the evening before lay on the table, a stark reminder of the reality that awaited him. Today was the day he had to report for military duty, a duty to a country he was still learning to call home. He packed a small bag with a few belongings, his heart heavy with a mix of duty and apprehension. The recruitment center was a beehive of activity, with young men from all walks of life coming in. Some were eager, filled with a sense of adventure and patriotism, while others carried the same worried look that Josef had. No matter where they came from, they were all here now, united by a common call. Josef was quickly processed, given a number, and sent along with others to a training camp. The camp was a flurry of activity, with drills, marches, and the constant barking of orders. He was issued a uniform that was too big in some places and too tight in others, and boots that gave him blisters from the first day. Training was tough. Every day was filled with rigorous exercises, weapons training, and learning how to work as a unit. Josef found it all both exhausting and exhilarating. Back home, he had never imagined he would be part of something like this. The language barrier made it even more challenging, but he was determined to keep up and not let his comrades or himself down. As the weeks went by, Josef began to form bonds with the other men. They came from different backgrounds, spoke different languages at home, but here they were all the same. They shared stories, laughed, and helped each other through the tough moments. In the rare free moments, they would talk about their families, their hopes, and what they missed about home. One of the friends Josef made was a young man named Michael, a second-generation immigrant whose parents had come from Italy. Michael had a way with words and would often lift the spirits of the others with his jokes and stories. He taught Josef bits of English, and in exchange, Josef shared stories of his homeland. In the midst of the chaos, they forged a friendship that made the hardship a little easier to bear. But it wasn't all camaraderie and growth. The reality of what lay ahead was always present. They would hear stories from the front lines, some inspiring and others terrifying. The trainers reminded them constantly that what they were preparing for was no game. It was about survival, duty, and fighting for the freedom of the world. The training also included learning to navigate different terrains, understanding strategy, and practicing in simulated combat situations. Josef learned to handle weapons, to move silently, and to communicate with his unit under stressful conditions. Each night he fell into his bunk, exhausted but a little more prepared for what was to come. Then one day, the training was over. The men were gathered and told they would soon be deployed. The air was thick with a mix of fear, anticipation, and a sense of duty. They were no longer just trainees. They were soldiers, about to be tested in ways they could hardly imagine. As they packed their bags and prepared for departure, Josef felt a deep sense of camaraderie with his fellow soldiers. They were a band of brothers now, bound together by a common cause. He thought of his journey to America, the vastness of this new land, and how his story was now intricately woven into its fabric. With a deep breath and a determined spirit, Josef was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The day had come. Josef and his unit were lined up, bags packed, ready to be transported to the front lines. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. They were about to leave the familiar grounds of the training camp and head into the unknown. Josef's heart pounded in his chest. A mix of fear and a strange sense of readiness filled him. He thought about his family, his journey to America, and now how far he had come to be here, standing shoulder to shoulder with fellow soldiers, all bound for the same daunting destination. The journey to the front was long and arduous. They traveled by truck, then by train, and finally on foot. With each mile, the reality of the war crept closer. The laughter and chatter that had filled the early days of training were replaced with silent reflection and last-minute checks of equipment. Josef felt a camaraderie with his fellow soldiers, a shared sense of purpose that bolstered his courage. As they neared the front, the signs of war became more evident. They passed through towns that bore the scars of conflict, saw wounded soldiers returning from the front, and heard the distant rumble of artillery. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and the weight of what lay ahead. Finally, they arrived at their designated position, a stretch of front line that was to be their home and battlefield. The trenches were muddy and cramped, a stark contrast to the vast open spaces Josef had dreamed of in America. But it was here, in this harsh, unforgiving environment, that Josef would play his part in the great conflict that engulfed the world. The first few days at the front were a blur of activity. Josef and his unit were quickly integrated into the routine of trench life. They took turns standing guard, patrolling the no-man's land and maintaining their positions. The enemy was close, sometimes so close they could hear them moving or talking. The nights were filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the cries of the wounded. Josef's first encounter with the enemy was terrifying. A sudden attack in the early hours of the morning caught them by surprise. He found himself firing his weapon, not fully comprehending the chaos around him. When it was over, the reality of the war hit him. There were casualties on both sides, young men like him, caught in the maelstrom of conflict. As the days turned into weeks, Josef witnessed the horrors and heroism of war. He saw friends injured and lost, experienced the relentless fear and exhaustion, and also the moments of profound bravery and solidarity. He wrote letters home when he could, trying to convey a sense of hope and reassure his family, all the while wondering about the world he'd left behind and the vastness of the journey he was on. There were moments of quiet, too, brief interludes where he would look out over the desolate landscape and reflect on the vastness of it all. The war seemed endless, a vast machine that consumed everything in its path. Yet, in the midst of it, he found a deep sense of connection with his fellow soldiers, a shared determination to persevere, to make their mark, however small, in the vast tapestry of history. One day, a significant battle loomed on the horizon, a battle that would test Josef and his unit like never before. They knew the enemy was planning a major offensive, and they were to hold their position at all costs. The night before, the men talked quietly amongst themselves, sharing thoughts of home, dreams of the future, and promises to look out for each other. Josef felt a mix of fear and resolve. He was no longer just a soldier. He was part of a brotherhood, fighting not just for his own survival, but for the men beside him, and for the ideals that had brought him to this distant land. As dawn broke, the battle began. It was a maelstrom of noise, fear, and confusion. Josef fought with everything he had, moving on instinct and the training that had been drilled into him. The world narrowed to the moment, each action a desperate bid to survive and protect his comrades. When the dust settled, Josef was still standing, but the landscape around him had changed. There were losses, faces that would never return to the barracks, dreams that would never be realized. But there was also a sense of grim accomplishment. They had held their position, repelled the enemy, and lived to fight another day. Exhausted, Josef sat in the trench, looking out over the scarred battlefield. He realized how small his own story was in the vastness of the war, yet also how vital. Each man's courage, each moment of bravery and sacrifice, was a thread in the larger fabric of history. As he prepared for the next day, with all its uncertainty and potential for both horror and heroism, Josef knew that his journey was far from over. The war was a vast, unfathomable entity, and he was but one part of it. But he also knew that he would continue to fight, to survive, and to find his way in the vast and tumultuous world that was America at war. As the seasons changed, so did the intensity of the war. Each day brought new challenges and dangers, and the front line was a constant barrage of activity and tension. Josef and his unit had become seasoned soldiers, their faces marked by the weariness of battle, but also a hardened resolve. They had seen too much to be the fresh-faced recruits they once were. Now, every moment was about survival and supporting the man next to you. The battles raged on, each one seeming more fierce and desperate than the last. Josef found himself in a variety of situations, leading a charge against an enemy position, defending a crucial stronghold, or embarking on dangerous patrols into no man's land. The landscape around them bore the scars of war, cratered and barren, a stark reminder of the destructive power of human conflict. One particular battle stood out in Josef's memory, a day that would be etched in his mind forever. It was an offensive meant to break through the enemy lines and turn the tide in their favor. The bombardment started at dawn, a terrifying cacophony of explosions and gunfire that shook the earth itself. As the order came to advance, Josef felt a momentary surge of fear, quickly pushed down by the training and instinct that now drove him. The world became a narrow tunnel of focus as he ran forward, the sounds of battle all around him. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. He saw comrades fall, heard the cries of the wounded, but he kept moving forward, driven by a force he could no longer define. The battle was chaos, a blur of fighting, running, and constant danger. Josef moved with his unit, taking cover, firing at the enemy, and pushing forward. There were moments when time seemed to slow down, and he could see the faces of the enemy soldiers, young men like him, caught in the same deadly dance. He wondered if they too thought of home, of a life beyond the war. As the day wore on, the battle intensified. Josef's unit was tasked with taking a key enemy position, a fortified bunker that was raining death upon them. It seemed an impossible task, but they had their orders. With a mix of fear and determination, they moved forward, covering each other, using every bit of training and instinct they had. The fight for the bunker was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the confined space, each man fighting for his life. Josef was among the first to enter, his rifle now useless in the close quarters, relying on his bayonet and sheer will to survive. The fight seemed to last forever, but finally, the bunker was theirs. They had achieved their objective, but the cost was high. Josef looked around at the aftermath, the toll of the battle evident in the bodies of friends and foes alike. In the days that followed, the battle continued, each day a repetition of the last, a cycle of attack and defense, advance and retreat. The moments of quiet were few, precious times to catch their breath, tend to the wounded, and prepare for the next onslaught. Throughout it all, Josef felt a profound sense of connection to his fellow soldiers. They were a band of brothers, their fates intertwined by the war. They shared everything: food, stories, fears, and hopes. In the darkest moments, it was this bond that kept him going, the knowledge that he was not alone in this vast and terrible landscape. As the war dragged on, Josef felt the weight of it all bearing down on him. The constant danger, the loss of friends, the sheer exhaustion of it. Yet, he also felt a deep sense of purpose. He was fighting for something larger than himself, for the future of his adopted country, for the ideals that had brought him here. The battles raged, each one a testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who fought. Josef was but one soldier in a vast sea of many, each with their own story, their own journey through the storm of war. But together, they were a force, a testament to the resilience and bravery of the human spirit. The war continued its relentless pace, but in the rare moments of calm between the storms of battle, Josef and his comrades would gather to receive letters from home. These letters were like precious lifelines, a connection to a world that seemed increasingly distant and unreal amidst the harsh realities of war. The day the mail arrived was always a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Everyone hoped for good news, or at least a few words of comfort and love from family and friends. As Josef held his letters, his hands would tremble slightly, a mixture of eagerness and dread of what news they might bring. When Josef opened his letters, he was transported back to his life before the war. He could almost smell the familiar scents of his mother's cooking, or hear the laughter of his siblings. The letters were filled with news of everyday life, the harvest, neighborhood gossip, and messages of love and encouragement. His family tried to keep the tone light and hopeful, but Josef could sense the underlying worry and longing in their words. At times, Josef would receive letters from friends he had made during his brief time in America before the war. They wrote about the changes the war had brought to their lives, the rationing, the factory work, and the constant worry for loved ones serving overseas. They would share news of mutual friends, some of whom had also been drafted, and express their hopes for a swift and victorious end to the conflict. But it wasn't just receiving letters that brought comfort to Josef. It was also the act of writing them. He would sit with paper and pen, trying to find the right words to convey his experiences without causing undue worry. He wrote of the camaraderie with his fellow soldiers, the small moments of beauty amidst the destruction, and his hopes for the future. He tried to paint a picture of his life at the front, but always with a careful hand, not wanting to reveal the full extent of the fear and hardship. In his letters, Josef would often reflect on the vastness of his journey, from a young immigrant arriving in America to a soldier fighting in a foreign land. He pondered the twists of fate that had brought him here and expressed his determination to see the war through, to make his family and adopted country proud. The letters from home were not just a source of personal comfort. They were a reminder of what they were all fighting for, not just the abstract ideals of freedom and democracy, but the very real lives and happiness of the people they loved. In the darkest times, it was this thought that gave Josef the strength to carry on, to face another day of battle and uncertainty. As the war dragged on, the letters became even more crucial. They were a touchstone, a reminder of a world beyond the trenches and battlefields, a world worth fighting for. And when the mail call was over, and the letters read and reread until they were almost memorized, Josef and his comrades would tuck them away carefully, small beacons of hope in a time of darkness. In those moments, with the letters clutched in their hands, the vastness of America and the world seemed a little smaller, a little more like home, and they knew that, no matter how far they were from the places and people they loved, they were not forgotten, that their sacrifices were seen and appreciated, and that, in the hearts and thoughts of those back home, they were never truly alone. The war had become a constant cycle of intense fighting, brief rests, and then back to the front lines. The men were worn down, but they pushed forward, driven by duty and the bond they shared as soldiers. Josef had seen much since his arrival at the front, but nothing could have prepared him for the day that would forever change his perception of the war and himself. It was early morning, and the sky was just beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn. The air was tense with the anticipation of an impending battle. Intelligence had warned of a significant enemy offensive, and every man knew this day could be decisive. As they prepared, checking their weapons and equipment, there was a sense of grim determination among them. They were ready to do whatever was necessary to hold the line. The battle began with an earth-shaking barrage from the enemy artillery. The world turned into a cacophony of explosions, screams, and the relentless rat-tat-tat of machine guns. Josef and his unit were in a crucial sector, one that needed to be held at all costs. They fought fiercely, repelling wave after wave of enemy soldiers, but the enemy kept coming, seemingly endless in number. As the fight continued, Josef's friend, Michael, was hit. He went down, wounded and unable to move from an exposed position. The situation was dire, with enemy fire intensifying and Michael lying in the open, vulnerable to every shot. Without hesitation, Josef made a decision. He couldn't leave his friend out there to die. Under a hail of bullets, Josef ran out to Michael, dragging him back to safety. It was an act of pure courage, one that seemed to defy the very instinct of survival. But for Josef, there was no choice. Michael was more than a friend. He was a brother in arms, and leaving him was unthinkable. The moment seemed to stretch out, each second a lifetime as Josef pulled Michael back towards their trench. Finally, they were back, but not unscathed. Josef had been hit, a searing pain in his side that told him the injury was serious. But there was no time to think about that now. They were still in the middle of a battle, and every man was needed. The act of bravery didn't go unnoticed. The men in his unit saw what he had done and were inspired by his courage. Josef's actions seemed to ignite a new fire in them, a renewed determination to hold their ground, no matter what. And hold it they did. The enemy offensive was repelled and the line was held, but at a high cost. Many were wounded or lost, and the landscape was a testament to the ferocity of the battle. Later, as Josef was being tended to by the medics, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. He had saved Michael's life, but the thought of being a hero felt strange, almost uncomfortable. He had acted on impulse, driven by the bond of friendship and the chaos of the moment. Yet his actions had made a difference, not just for Michael, but for all those who witnessed it. He had shown what one person could do, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As he lay there, recovering from his wounds, Josef thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a young immigrant filled with hopes and dreams to a soldier fighting in a foreign land. He had seen the worst of what humanity could do, the destruction and pain of war, but he had also seen the best, the courage, the sacrifice, and the unwavering spirit of his fellow soldiers. The war would continue, with more battles, more hardships, and more moments of fear and heroism. But for Josef, something had shifted. He realized that heroism wasn't just about grand gestures or dramatic acts. It was about the small choices, the decision to do what was right, even when it was the hardest thing to do. And in the vastness of the war, it was these moments of human courage and connection that shone the brightest. In the days and weeks following his act of bravery, Josef found himself in a military hospital, recovering from his wounds. The once unrelenting noise of the front was replaced by the quiet bustle of nurses and the groans of injured soldiers. Lying in his bed, Josef had time to reflect on the toll the war had taken on him and his comrades. The physical injuries were evident, the bandaged wounds, the missing limbs, the pained expressions of young men lying in beds just like his. But there were other wounds, less visible but just as profound. The mental and emotional scars of war, the memories of fallen friends, and the relentless stress of constant danger had left their mark on every soldier. Josef thought back to the early days of training, the faces of the men he had joined with, full of hope and determination. So many of those faces were now gone, lost to the unforgiving machine of war, and those who remained had changed. The innocence had faded from their eyes, replaced by a look that spoke of too much seen and endured. As he lay there, Josef received visits from his fellow soldiers, including Michael, who was recovering from his injuries. They didn't speak much of the battle or the war. Those memories were still too raw. Instead, they talked of home, of the meals they missed, and the loved ones they longed to see again. They laughed and joked, a brief respite from the grim reality of their situation. But the nights were the hardest for Josef. In the dark, the memories would come rushing back. The sound of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, the feeling of utter exhaustion and fear. He would wake up sweating, his heart pounding, only to realize he was safe in his bed, far from the front lines. These were the signs of what the doctors called shell shock, known today as PTSD. Many soldiers like Josef were struggling with the psychological toll of the war, the constant high alert, and the traumatic experiences that had become a daily part of their lives. The military hospitals were becoming as much about healing minds as they were about healing bodies. But the war continued outside the walls of the hospital, and soon Josef was deemed fit enough to return to his unit. The thought of going back to the front filled him with a mix of dread and a sense of duty. He didn't feel like the same man who had left for war, eager and proud to serve his adopted country. He was hardened now, aware of the true cost of war, but also deeply committed to the brothers in arms who were still out there, fighting. As he prepared to leave the hospital, Josef took a moment to say goodbye to the men he had shared this brief time with. They were all on their own journeys, each marked by the war in different ways. Some would return to the front, others would go home, their fighting days over. But they were all bound by a shared experience, a brotherhood forged in the most challenging circumstances. Walking out of the hospital, Josef felt the weight of what he was returning to. He knew the battles ahead would be just as hard, perhaps harder, as the war dragged on. But he also carried with him the memories of the moments of humanity and bravery he had witnessed, the small acts of kindness, and the bonds of friendship that had sustained him. As he rejoined his unit, Josef was greeted with cheers and pats on the back. He was one of them, a soldier who had shown great courage and was willing to face the dangers ahead for the sake of his comrades and his country. But as he looked into the faces of the men around him, he saw his own mixed feelings reflected back. They were all marked by the toll of war, each carrying their own burdens of fear, loss, and hope. The war would continue, and Josef with it. But he was no longer just fighting for victory or for the ideals that had been spoken of so passionately when he had first arrived in America. He was fighting for the men beside him, for the chance to see another day, and for the hope that one day the war would end and they could all return home to a world forever changed but still worth fighting for. As the war finally neared its end, the world Josef had known seemed both incredibly distant and forever altered. The announcement of armistice brought a wave of relief mixed with disbelief. The fighting had stopped, but the echoes of the war would linger in the minds and hearts of those who had lived through it. Returning home was a surreal experience for Josef. The streets of his adopted city were filled with celebrations, people hugging and cheering, soldiers being welcomed back as heroes. But as he walked through the crowd, Josef felt a strange sense of detachment. He had dreamed of this moment so many times, yet now that it was here, it was nothing like he had imagined. The war had changed Josef. The young, hopeful immigrant who had arrived in America seeking a new life had become a seasoned soldier, marked by the experiences of battle. He found it hard to relate to the joyous scenes around him, knowing that the price of this victory had been so high, the loss so profound. Reintegration into civilian life was a challenge. The skills and instincts that had served him so well on the battlefield were out of place in the peace that followed. He struggled with the memories of what he had seen and done, the constant undercurrent of tension and alertness that didn't fade with the end of the war. Josef sought out his old friends and found that many of them were dealing with similar struggles. They would meet and talk, sharing their experiences and supporting each other in the transition back to civilian life. These conversations were a lifeline, a way to process what they had been through and start to look towards the future. One of the hardest parts for Josef was talking to his family about the war. They were overjoyed to have him home, safe and sound, but he could see the worry in their eyes when he spoke of his experiences. He tried to spare them the worst details, focusing instead on the moments of camaraderie and bravery, the times when humanity shone through the darkness. As the country began to rebuild and move forward, so did Josef. He found work and started to put down roots, building a life in the peace that he had fought for. But the war was never far from his thoughts. It had shaped him in ways he was still discovering, influencing his dreams, his relationships, and his view of the world. Yet, amidst the challenges, there were also moments of hope and redemption. Josef saw the country he had fought for growing and changing, driven by the same spirit of determination and resilience that had carried him through the war. He met other veterans who were using their experiences to make a difference, advocating for peace and supporting those who had been affected by the war. As time passed, Josef began to see his service in the war not just as a time of hardship and loss, but as a period of growth and learning. He had been part of something much larger than himself, a vast effort that had changed the course of history. And though the cost had been high, he was proud of what he had done, of the sacrifices he and his fellow soldiers had made for the future of their country and the world. The war had ended, but for Josef and many others, a new chapter was just beginning. It was a time to heal, to reflect, and to build on the lessons learned from the vast and tumultuous journey they had been on. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and opportunities, but they faced it with the same courage and determination that had carried them through the darkest days of the war. And as Josef looked towards the horizon, he knew that whatever lay ahead, he was ready. The war had taught him about the depths of human cruelty and the heights of bravery and compassion. It had shown him the vastness of the world and his own strength and resilience. And with these lessons in his heart, he stepped forward into the new world that awaited him, a world of endings and beginnings, forever shaped by the echoes of the past. Years had rolled on since the war's end, and the world around Josef had transformed in countless ways. Buildings had been erected where once there were ruins, and the laughter of children playing in the streets often replaced the solemn silence that had once pervaded. Yet, within Josef, there remained an internal battlefield, a war within that he continued to navigate each day. Josef recognized that while the physical war had concluded, the emotional and psychological scars it left were more persistent. He would wake from dreams where the sounds of battle still rang in his ears and find himself momentarily back in the trenches, his heart racing. The war had etched itself into the deepest parts of him, a constant reminder of what he had endured and lost. But with time, Josef also learned to understand and cope with these inner battles. He sought solace in writing, pouring his memories and feelings onto paper, transforming his experiences into stories and poems that captured the complexities of his journey. It was a way to externalize the turmoil within and find a sense of peace and understanding. He also found strength in the community around him, particularly in fellow veterans who shared the unspoken bond of those who had seen the darkness of war. Together, they supported one another, building a network of understanding and compassion that helped each navigate the continued challenges of post-war life. They were a testament to the enduring spirit of those who had served, a band of brothers and sisters who refused to let the war define them. As the years passed, Josef watched as the world continued to change. He saw new conflicts arise, and with them, new generations of soldiers returning home, carrying their own burdens. It pained him to know that the cycle of war and its aftermath continued, but it also reaffirmed his commitment to helping those who were now walking the path he once had. He became involved in initiatives to support returning veterans, lending his voice and experience to help guide them back to civilian life. He understood that while each person's journey was unique, the need for support, understanding, and community was universal. Josef also took time to engage with the younger generations, sharing his story not as a glorification of war, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He spoke in schools and at community events, his narrative one of countless threads in the vast tapestry of human history, offering lessons of courage, sacrifice, and the importance of striving for a world where such sacrifices are no longer needed. In his quieter moments, Josef would reflect on the vastness of his own life journey, from a young man seeking a new beginning in America to a soldier in the throes of war, and now an elder with a lifetime of experiences. He realized that his story, like all stories, was both deeply personal and part of a larger human narrative. The war within might never fully cease, the memories and scars too deeply embedded, but Josef found a way to live with it, to use it as a source of strength and empathy. He understood that the true battle was not against the memories themselves, but in ensuring they did not overshadow the present or the future. As the final chapter of his story was being written, Josef looked out at the world with a sense of quiet acceptance and hope. The war had taught him about the darkest and brightest corners of the human soul, and he carried that knowledge with a sense of responsibility and purpose. He had witnessed the vast expanse of human suffering and joy, and through it all, he had found his path, one marked by resilience, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to a more peaceful and understanding world. And so, as the sun set on another day, Josef felt a sense of peace. The war within, like the wars of the world, was a part of him, but it did not define him. He was a survivor, a storyteller, and a beacon of hope for those who still struggled with their own battles. His journey was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a spirit vast and deep, capable of immense destruction but also boundless love and resilience.